Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer. This episode is called The Wolk Family Migration. My guest is Dave Wolk, who is well known to this community as an educator, a school leader, former president of Castleton College, and a lifelong member of the Rutland community. This episode, which has been a long time in preparation, features a journey that Dave and I made together to recover some of his ancestral past. Dave's grandfather was a prominent business leader in the Rutland community, and prior to this investigation, Dave knew very little about his family's immigration story from Lithuania to the United States. Among many immigrants, there is not a feeling of great nostalgia to talk about the past. While Dave knew some of the broad outlines of his family's journey to America, he did not know the specifics. Because of COVID, we have done this through Zoom. This will be a new adventure for Historically Speaking, and I hope that we can continue to bring you new episodes through this medium. Hi, Dave.
Michael, good to see you.
So we are preparing a Zoom interview for Historically Speaking. This is historical because this is the first time that we've done something like this for Historically Speaking. So here we go, and we are going to be talking about your Wolk ancestors and how and why they came to the United States. So since this is your family, I'll start with you. So what do you know about your great-grandfather?
Well, my dad and his brothers weren't that forthcoming about their ancestors. As my dad was sort of fading away, I had the privilege of being with him. He figured out in 7 different places, hospital rooms and nursing homes, where I would sit on a recliner next to his bed and touch him, and this went on for a long time. And we had so many great conversations, but it wasn't until the end that he started revealing more about his parents. But he knew very little about his grandparents, my great-grandparents. And now we have this, as all your viewers do, have these wonderful family lineages, because Lynn and I have 7 kids between us and 7 grandchildren. We're so blessed. And then we're talking about their great-great-great-grandparents, thanks to you, Michael. So I don't know much about them. I know a little bit about my grandmother and grandfather, who ended up coming here from both Poland and Lithuania, and then finally settling in Rutland. But I know very little about my paternal great-grandparents. So you can educate me, as you always do, Michael.
Well, one of the things that I think is a good starting point is that I knew that Solomon was here in Burlington by 1900. And even though a lot of people today cannot read cursive, what I have up on the slide here is the 1900 census. So you can see Solomon is on the first line, born 1852. That's an approximation. His wife, Dora, etc. But what is really telling here is you look at the top line, it says that he and Dora have been married for 22 years. Of course, birthplace is Russia, because Lithuania would be part of the Russian Empire until the collapse of the Tsar's empire. But interestingly, it says year after you have Russia 3 times, so that's his birthplace, his parents' birthplace, but 1888 is the year of his immigration. So by 1900, he had been in the United States for 12 years, and he is already a naturalized citizen. If you look under Solomon's line for Dora, Hyman, your grandfather, and then Carrie and Stella, the younger daughters, they immigrated at a different time. So this conforms to the picture that we know about a lot of men from Eastern Europe coming first establishing a foothold here. And if this record is right, Dora and the children came approximately 7 years after Solomon did. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But for you, Dave, I think the most interesting thing about Solomon in this census is that it says that he is a teacher.
Yeah.
You know that about him.
Yeah.
He was a teacher.
All I know. Yeah.
So in the next slide, I thought, well, teacher, what did that mean in Burlington in 1900? So in the next slide here, I have the Burlington 1898 directory, where it lists Solomon. You can see I have an arrow pointing to him, and he is a teacher at the Hebrew school. He's living on 101 Hyde Street. But if we look in the next directory entry from 1901, he's a peddler, which kind of conforms to the oral history that you had told me that your great-grandfather was a peddler. So here's what I read into this. As a man coming from Lithuania late in the 19th century, he would have, if he is educated and teaching in a Hebrew school, he would know Hebrew, he would know Yiddish. He would also have to know Russian to survive in that environment. And with few Yiddish-speaking people in Burlington at that time, I'm sure he learned English. So he's mastered at least 4 languages, but how could he earn a living and support a family teaching at a Hebrew school in Burlington at the turn of the 20th century? So I think that's why we see both occupations, because we know that teachers in general were not well paid at the turn of the 20th century. So you can imagine a man like your great-grandfather having such a specialty.
Yes, so that conforms with some of what you're showing me right now, because Hyman, my father's father, was born in Lithuania in 1888 and then came here, my dad thought, around 1895. And his later wife, Alice, was born in 1883 in Poland. But my father always thought she was born in Odessa in southern Russia. And his siblings knew very little either. So this is all new, interesting information, maybe just to you and me and not to your viewers. But it's, and you were talking about teaching Hebrew school. There were probably just a handful of Jewish people there, as there always have been in Rutland. I don't believe there ever been more than 200 or 250 Jewish people in Rutland at any time.
I think the proportionate size of that community belies their influence. And I know that when I researched Michael Dick's grandfather, who had a similar pattern of migration from Burlington to Rutland, there's a larger story here of how people network together. So this card that I have is my next slide. This is the registration of Solomon becoming an American citizen. And this is just an abstract of the record, but it gives his birthplace, his Russia, year 1849. He had been in the United States approximately 10 years. And interestingly, you can see the names of the 2 people that made affidavits to Solomon's character. So we have I. Perlman, I'm sure the first name is Isaac, and then a Harris London. I would be curious about both of those names. But what really is going to...
Of course you would be.
to move this story forward, nothing so far tells us exactly where Solomon came from. So as I was looking, and I haven't given up the quest completely yet, but I just could not find a manifest for Solomon around 1888. But I did find Dora and your grandfather and the great aunts. So here is the shipping manifest. Again, it's hard to read. It is the ship Reitha sailing out of Hamburg It arrived in New York on the 6th of October, 1894. And you can see roughly where the arrow is, Dora, age 40, Rachel. Now, here's the part that gets tricky if you don't know something about names. The names would have been rendered in Yiddish. So if you look at, you have Dora, Rachel. Now that's probably Miriam. The next name is Chaim. You can see Chaim, age 11. That's grandfather. That's Hyman.
Right.
And he's 11 years old. So that puts his birthday closer to 1883. Now, the part about this...
He was actually born May 25th, 82.
Okay, so that's pretty close to this. But the part that is wild here that I can't make sense of yet, if it's true, because sometimes manifests do have errors in them, is it says intended location or territory, Iowa. Now, we don't know for sure where Solomon was before 1898. He doesn't show up in Burlington directories before that time. So it is possible they could have gone to Iowa and not liked rural life. That's something that may one day be recovered, but it's a strange piece of the story. But thus far in this manifest, there isn't anything yet here that tells us exactly where they came from. But since we know that the ship originated in Hamburg, we do have digitized records of the ship manifests from Hamburg, and this is what we have. So here is the manifest from the German America line, and where the arrow is, you can see Dora's name and the children once again, and it gives their birthplace of Kovno, Russia, which is in Lithuania. So Kovno. And knowing something about that specific place, this is going to open a whole new door of history to you, because another confirmation of where they came from exactly is that Hyman's sister Carrie died before her father in the influenza epidemic. She was age 35. And if you notice here, it reads, she was a daughter of Solomon Wolk of Burlington and was born in the city of Kovno, Russia, Lithuania, coming to this country with her parents. So there's two places where we know the exact origin, which is sometimes hard to pinpoint. And considering that Solomon was a teacher, we do know here on one of the maps that the city of Kovno is today Kaunas, because with all the changes in geography in Eastern Europe. And this is the second largest city in Lithuania. And prior to the Holocaust, this was a major center of Jewish learning, that the city had 100 Jewish organizations, 40 synagogues, Yiddish schools, 4 Hebrew high schools. So this is the context that Solomon left, came to America. But we all know why he left, because things are deteriorating in Eastern Europe. And considering of what would happen later at mid-20th century, he was very fortunate to have his whole family removed. So there you have the exact place in Lithuania where they came from.
Well, that fits with what my father told me. Didn't have the exact dates, but that they were essentially both, my grandmother, his mother, escaped anti-Semitism and the pogroms in Poland, and they did in Lithuania as well.
Mm-hmm.
So they were escaping religious persecution. They came here to Ellis Island, but at different times. My grandfather went before my grandmother.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. And I think, of course, your grandparents were long dead, but I'm sure that your grandfather had to have known that there were people that he grew up with that were slaughtered during the Holocaust, because when We have the Soviet Union invading Russia in 1941. We know how horrific conditions were at that time. And I think there are ways in which people deal with overwhelming tragedy like that. In my own family, my great-grandparents' generation coming from Ireland to escape famine, they're not willing to talk about that. Their sorrow was so deep, they just didn't want to acknowledge it. And my family was very tight-lipped about the exact circumstances of what propelled them to immigrate. And I imagine for a lot of people, it's a similar common denominator that they don't want to talk about such things as persecution, or really the threat of annihilation as to what happened later.
Right.
I have another interesting slide here. Here is Dora's death, where at least someone knew who her parents were. Now, these names, of course, we would have to unscramble, but there you have it. But a couple of other things to share with you, just how things get recorded. When Dora died, if you were to look for an obituary in the Burlington Free Press for Dora Wolk, you would not find her listed. She's listed as Mrs. Solomon, and that's how you would find it. And again, this lists the fact that she's been 22 years in the country, who her children are, etc. But what I begin to see as a pattern, we won't look at that, is when Solomon died, his obituary was never reported in the Burlington Free Press. It was reported in Rutland because his life was viewed through the success of his son. Yeah. So notice the way that this begins. It's not about Solomon, but this is about your grandfather, Hyman H. Wolk of the Surprise Department Store, was in Burlington this week on account of the illness and death of his father.
Right.
And this is the part that I think is really comical in the larger scheme of things. In 1916, Mr. Wolk of this city lost his mother and sister a year ago at the Christmas season, only last month. So here, I mean, you think of the cultural dissonance here, that they're talking about how they're losing people during the Christmas season, and yet that's not part of how they would have viewed the world. So,
well, it is what it is. That's the world they lived in, just as his wife being known as Mrs. Solomon. And fortunately, that's not the way it is today. You know, my dad was born just a month on October 4th, 1919, and his brother was 10 years old, and his, brother Morris, the one who had walks, tots, and teens, and Sid was 5 years old at that time. So they had Hyman and Alice, his wife, had 3 sons. It's interesting, the names changed. See where it says Mrs. H. Lazarowitz? My dad told me that when they were trying to escape religious persecution, names got changed, and that Wolk might not be the original name from 2 generations before. It could have been Wolkowitz. And you see where it says Lazarowitz? They changed that to Lazarus. Some people might remember Lazarus Department Store in Middlebury, and that was my father's cousin Stan Lazarus, and his brother Mike for a while had that store as well. And my grandfather's sister, Stella, was actually his half-sister. And I've discovered that since you've fueled this interest in it for me. I've always sort of had it, and I have some time now to do it for my whole family, but I've sent my DNA sample to ancestry.com, and in so doing, I haven't gotten it back yet, but I've also learned so much through Ancestry about relatives on all of our sides. You know, for our kids' benefit, my wife Lynn, who was Lynn Huntoon before she was Lynn Wolk, we've learned a lot about her family as well, and it's been really interesting. I mean, I don't work for Ancestry.com, but it cost $100, and it's allowed me not only to do the DNA sample, and who knows what I'll find out there, but also to do this extensive research with some primary sources, although not as not as rich as the ones that you're providing, but you learn a lot. And I'm finding it very interesting because no one in my family knew much about our heritage. My dad wouldn't talk about it. He would talk about a little bit about World War II and his experiences in Okinawa, but he was very hazy. And I remember, lying next to him, really quizzing him about what happened in the late 1800s, and he knew very little about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting you talked about the surprise store. That's where then after that was the economy store, Rutlanders will remember. And then, oh, there you go. And that's great. There you are, right with it. And that became the economy store. That's where the Opera House is, or was, and still is. And after he had the surprise store, he either sold that or went out of business. I'm not sure. But he then started Wolk's store. It was called Wolk's Style Shop, where the Wonder Feet Children's Museum is now.
Yep.
And right on Center Street. And then later, my aunt and uncle took it over. It became Wolk's Tots and Teens. And then my cousin Carol and her husband Billy took it over. And then it was Wolk's, just Wolk's, before they closed that a few years ago. But it's a long heritage. And the other brothers, so my dad, born and raised in Rutland, went to UVM and UVM Med School, the Army, goes to New York, meets my mom. 3 weeks later, they're engaged. 2 months later, they're married. They come back. My brother was born there. And then, they lived in Rutland. But the other son, Sid, went away to college and never came back. And anyhow, I could go on and on. But it's really interesting to look back at this. You've done some good research.
I think that there are so many things, and I dare say that you are bitten by this bug now, as many people are. And I think when we realize that we are becoming the older generation in our own family and we don't have parents and grandparents to ask these questions, it becomes a way of transmitting a heritage, transmitting a legacy. And I think for me, genealogy is the intersection of history and a person in looking at how people responded to the larger forces around them. So, of course, there's a lot in your immigration story that conforms to the larger picture, but I think it's a more difficult chasm to bridge because of language barriers and so much about Yiddish culture that is being lost. And contrary to what a lot of us heard growing up, that all the records were destroyed. Yes, many records were destroyed, but who would think that we'd be able to see what we can find digitized? And I think what lies in store for you when your DNA results come back, and we can certainly talk about that at another time, but you might have relatives in Europe, you might have relatives in Israel, you may have cousins in California that you never heard of because the connections have been lost. It was unusual that your great-grandfather only had one son, Hyman, but certainly he would have had brothers and sisters. And an interesting thing that kind of takes us beyond the scope of what we can do in this short a time, but there was another Dora Wolk who came through Ellis Island in 1906 that came from Kovno, same village. So I think the more that we get puzzle pieces to all of this, you're going to see a much larger immigration story. And one thing I would be curious about, your great-grandfather's gravestone in the Jewish cemetery in South Burlington has a Hebrew inscription on it. I can't read it, but I'm sure someone can. And it may be that I've seen a little bit about that early synagogue in the old north end of Burlington that in its history lists your great-grandfather's name as the first Hebrew teacher in Burlington. So for you as an educator, here I think is a hidden gem in your family background that unknowingly you are accessing a legacy of teaching and education that probably was not known to your family.
Well, we're all teachers in our own way. In fact, I think the word rabbi is a
Yes.
synonym for teacher. So this has been really wonderful. I hope you can send me these slides so I can have, because here's what I've decided to do. You get to different stages in your life, and I'm sure anyone who may be watching this feels similarly, where you do your best to raise your kids, you do your best to honor your parents, and then you have grandchildren if you're really lucky, and we have 7 grandchildren. So a lot of what I'm thinking about now is how to educate them. For instance, at our house, we're fossil fuel free now. We've gone completely solar. Our cars run off the sun. Our house runs off the sun. And that was pretty interesting and sort of fun for me to explain this to my older grandchildren this summer about how it all works, just a lesson you teach. And by the same token, I'm more interested in this because I want our grandchildren to know something about their heritage, especially about our parents and grandparents. Haven't gone back as far as you have, but just so that they know more about the legacy. And I'm sure every family feels the same way.
When you get your DNA, Dave, what do you hope that will reveal to you? I mean, we all have to be open to the element of surprise, but
right.
What are you hoping that will tell you?
Well, I know people who have learned about, let's say, long lost relatives they never really knew about. Might have been a half sister or a half brother at some point. Given what happened then, I mentioned that my grandfather had a half sister, and that doesn't come up in the research, but it does come up clearly in ancestry. I just want to know more. I don't think I'll be shocked about anything because times were so different then. But it's very rich and revealing. And again, I'm doing this now with your inspiration because I'd like all of our kids and grandkids to get a sense of history that my brothers and I didn't have. My brother Tom is a recently retired doctor outside of Philadelphia. He was a pediatrician like my dad, married for a zillion years with great kids and grandkids. My brother Brad, recently retired OBGYN in Florida, and he and his wife have 7 kids. So obviously he missed a class in med school as an OBGYN, but they have a number of grandchildren now too. And my brothers and I are very close. We've never had a crossword. And a year ago, my dad died in 2016 and my mom in 2018. And, just as an aside, I've learned a lot about end of life and just spiritually as well as medically, because in the space of just a few years, well, we lost my wife, Diane, who you knew, after an 11.5-year battle with Alzheimer's. So that was a long goodbye. The last few years, she didn't know any of us. And then, we lost Lynn's parents and my parents in the course of just a few years. And it's so often that one passes away and then the next is not after. So we learned a lot about, in 5 different ways, the end of life. And that's another lesson that I'd like to impart to my kids and grandchildren too, to kind of remove some of the mystery or mystique about the end of life. Because it was quite a beautiful thing with my dad. And with my mom. Hers was really quick. When
Dave,
I was an applicant, we had moved to Florida and took care of my mom, and then she passed much more quickly than we anticipated, and we came back to Rutland, and here we are.
Dave, I thank you for your willingness to embark upon this adventure with me, and how we can do this at a time that it looks like we're going to be shuttering places again as COVID spikes. So I'm glad we could do this and do it safely. I thank you, and we will be looking forward to seeing this on our local Access TV.
Well, and the research you've done, Michael, is a real gift to my family. So thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.